My name is Louise Ryan and I'm Professor at London Metropolitan University. And it's my great pleasure today to present a short presentation on doing biographical interviews. So I'm just going to share my screen and present a short PowerPoint. So, biographical interviews. These are rich and in-depth forms of interviews. They are usually used to gain understanding and insight into life experiences as lived over time or within a very specific moment in time. Biographical interviews can be semi-structured, where the person is asked about very specific events, such as the lockdown during the pandemic. But it can also be quite usual for biographical interviews to be very open-ended and unstructured, so that a more narrative approach is used, and the interviewee is asked very general, open questions, which might start with something like, tell me about your childhood, tell me about your memories of growing up. Biographical interviews, because they aim to achieve a great deal of information and detail, require a high level of trust and rapport, and so they aim to be very relaxed and informal and really more like a conversation. Biographical interviews are in many ways very similar to oral history interviews, and in the literature sometimes biographical interviews and oral history interviews can almost be used interchangeably. But while the latter are usually looking back over distant events, biographical interviews can also involve current situations, as, for example, asking people about their experiences of the lockdown and the pandemic. And there's an article there which you might find useful in showing how you can use a lifeline format within a biographical interviews to help you to collect information about different dates and years and plotting time during the course of doing a biographical interview. Now, another way of doing a biographical interview is when you're trying to get somebody's overall biography. So rather than asking about a specific moment in time, you're trying to understand their overall life experiences. And this, for example, might be an approach that you would use if you were interviewing older people. So in my own research, I do a lot of work with older migrants, people who came to the UK as young people, often in the 1950s and 60s. And who are now entering advanced old age, often aged in their 80s and even in their 90s. And so in those biographical interviews, I'm really trying to understand their entire life experiences. And there's an article there that I wrote some years ago explaining that approach. It's also possible to do biographical interviews both as a one-off, where you just go and you interview somebody on one occasion, but also to use longitudinal methods, where you go back and you interview the same person on numerous occasions. And as you can imagine, if you're trying to capture somebody's entire life course, then it may be more helpful to go back and interview them on a few occasions to really capture all of that information. In addition, it's also possible to combine biographical interviews with other methods. A popular method, for example, is photo elicitation, where you ask the participant to bring along some photographs, perhaps of them in their childhood or in their young adult life, and you ask them to talk about those photographs as a way of a tool, really, to help you and to help them to remember and to explain and to visualize those earlier experiences during their biography. Now, when they work well, biographical interviews can be wonderful. They can be a very pleasant and rewarding experience, both for you as an interviewer, but also for the interviewee. There can be a great sense of satisfaction in having you as a researcher sit down and listen to somebody's life story and to be genuinely interested in what they have to say. After all, it's very unusual to have somebody sit down and say, tell me all about your life. I'm really interested. I want to hear all about it. Normally, it's quite hard to get somebody to sit down and listen to a very, very long story. But here, you've got somebody who's enthusiastically willing to do so. So for the interviewee, this can be a very rewarding experience. They can feel valued and respected. However, it is important to note that there are very specific ethical issues associated with biographical interviews. Now, obviously, all research of any kind involves ethical issues, and I'm sure elsewhere in your syllabus, you will have been looking at research ethics, so I'm not going to go into all the details now. But biographical interviews raise specific ethical issues, and this is partly because you are collecting a great deal of very personal information from one person. And this raises particular concerns about anonymity and confidentiality. When you've got so much information about one person, how are you going to protect their confidentiality? It's also possible that interviewees may become upset as they remember deeply personal events, which could include, for example, bereavement, family problems, relationship breakdown, financial worries, the serious illness of friends or relatives. And some of these stories can be sad, but they can also be upsetting to hear for the researcher. And it's important that the researcher is prepared for these kinds of sad stories and is able to respond to them appropriately. Hence, it's necessary that you should take the appropriate steps, such as giving the interviewee a break, listening sympathetically, allowing them to share their sad experience if they wish to, but also reminding them that they can stop, that they can change the subject, that if it's upsetting, they don't have to talk about it. It's also very important to have signposting. In other words, to bring along information about, for example, bereavement or counselling support when appropriate. But the researcher should remember that you are not a trained counsellor. It is not your role to start offering advice to somebody who may be upset. And therefore, it's always a good idea to have professional services, information details, phone numbers, websites available, and you can pass these on to the participant. You should never leave the participant when they're feeling very upset and raw. You should try to ensure that you've given them the necessary information that they then need to access support where appropriate. And that will also make you feel better that you're not walking away from somebody who's now feeling upset. So that's a kind of general discussion about biographical interviews, which you can find in a textbook. But it's also a nice opportunity for me to talk about how I do biographical interviews and about the research that I've been doing now over the last 20 years. I am a migration specialist, and I particularly do qualitative research with migrants. I especially focus on London. I'm based at a London University. I myself am a migrant. I've lived in London for over 25 years. And so I began my research in the early 2000s, looking at older Irish people who migrated to Britain in the years after World War II. And in fact, tens of thousands of Irish people were directly recruited to come and work in Britain in the post-war reconstruction. In other words, men who were recruited in very large numbers to come from Ireland to work in construction in Britain, and women were recruited in very large numbers to come and work in nursing as the NHS was set up in the late 1940s. And since then, I've developed my research to include other migrants, including people from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. As I mentioned, the main focus of my work is on London. And London, of course, is a city which has been defined by waves and generations of migrants. And I'm interested in how migrants who arrive as young people to study, to train, and to work in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and who are now entering advanced old age in London. And I use biographical interviews to understand their stories and experiences. And my current research is on migrant nurses. And as we know, migrants have been recruited in their tens of thousands since the very start of the NHS. Migrants in the NHS are not a new phenomenon. And here's a picture which shows the diversity, the enormous ethnic diversity of nurses, even from the 1950s and 60s working in the NHS. So my project is a 3-year project running from 2022 to 2024. There's a website link there. Sorry, it's a very long website where you can find out more information about my project. As I said, I'm using biographical interviews, and I'm also using photo elicitation, where the participants bring along photographs of them as young nurses, often wearing their nurse uniform, and they talk a lot about their early experiences of training and working in the NHS. So, for example, I just interviewed an 85-year-old lady, a retired nurse, just last week, and she made this wonderful statement where she said, without the Irish, Jamaican and Nigerian nurses, there would be no NHS. And she's talking there about the groups that were particularly prominent in the NHS as nurses in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. As I said, I use biographical interviews, and my main aim is to encourage these older ladies, some of them even in their 90s, to tell their stories. I use prompt questions like, tell me about your memories of growing up and going to school. Or, tell me why you decided to become a nurse. Then later in the interview, I might say, describe the journey to England. Do you remember how you travelled? Did you come by boat or by plane? Do you remember how you felt on the day that you arrived? Do you remember your initial reactions when you arrived in, say, Euston Station or Heathrow Airport? Now, some of the ladies I've interviewed are great storytellers. You only need to ask them one question, such as, describe your journey to England, and they are off on a long and detailed story with lots of extra information about incidents that may have occurred along the way. There may be some funny stories or even some sad anecdotes, but they're often rich and elaborate, providing great insights into their experiences at that time. However, not all interviewees are quite so chatty. Some interviewees are more shy or reserved. Maybe they're not used to speaking about themselves in such long and detailed ways. So in those cases, you really need to give more guidance, more encouragement, more prompting. So you may have to say things like, that is so interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Or ask for more specific details. Oh, I find that story so fascinating, but can you tell me a little bit more about what happened at that particular place or in that incident with that particular person you just mentioned? So in other words, you're listening very carefully to what they're saying, and you're prompting them and probing for them to really draw them out, to get them to speak more, to give more of that biographical information. As I said, sometimes it's very easy, sometimes it's more difficult. And your role as a researcher in biographical interviews is that listening technique, is responding, is looking out for opportunities to explore some stories and to draw the participants to impart more detail, to get them to relax and enjoy the experience. As I said, I use photo elicitation. So here's a photograph that one of the nurses brought along with her and her set, as it was called, people who were training the same year as her in her nurse's set. And this was when a bishop came and spoke to them about their training. And using a photograph like this can really open up a lot of stories, maybe funny stories about incidents that occurred. Now, some participants do not remember much about the actual details, and memory is a key issue when you're doing biographical interviews. Now, some of the older retired nurses that I've interviewed seem to have vivid memories of exactly when they travelled to London. They might say, oh, it was winter, I remember it was freezing cold. They have particular details that stick in their memories. Some even remember what they were wearing on the day that their parents may have bought them a new coat for the journey, or some little trigger that prompts a memory for them. And as an interviewer, you also need to be sensitive and flexible, because if they really can't remember, that's fine. Don't overpress them. Move on to other topics that they may prefer to discuss instead. And of course, sometimes when somebody says, I can't remember, that may mean that they don't want to talk about it. So you also need to be sensitive to these kinds of signals that they are giving you about what they're comfortable discussing and what they're not comfortable discussing. As an interviewer, it takes skill, but also years of experience to really get that confidence and sensitivity to encourage people to tell stories they want to tell, but also to recognize when they don't want to discuss certain things. Some of the interviewees spoke at great length about their nurse training, about their uniform. Some of them had great pride in their uniform. Some of them had funny anecdotes about how strict the matron was and maybe getting into trouble and getting told off by the matron. The experience of living in a nurse's home with other young trainee nurses from around the world. But I noticed that some of them, in their biographical interviews, they tend to talk less about their career and perhaps more about their family, more about their children. So you need to also find what is it that they are comfortable and want to talk about. So to conclude, the advantages of using biographical interviews are multiple. It gives you really rich data. You can get some very quotable data. When people are relaxed and they're telling you stories, you can get some really wonderful quotes. It can offer a real insight into specific events and moments in time, particularly from the past. It can really conjure up and evoke a picture, a really vivid picture of past events. It can be very rewarding both for you as a researcher, but also for the interviewee. As I said earlier, this is an opportunity for them to tell their story and really feel that someone has listened to them. Of course, there are also some disadvantages. It can be very labor intensive, very demanding, and time consuming both for you and for the participant. Therefore, it can be quite tiring, especially if you're interviewing older people. It relies a lot on memory work, and using prompts, including photo elicitation, can be a good way to help that memory work. But as I said, it can also raise very specific ethical challenges, especially around confidentiality and anonymity, given that you're collecting a huge amount of data from one person that might reveal some very personal details. And so you as a researcher need to decide and agree with the participant and with the help of the Research Ethics Committee how much of that information you need to conceal and what is appropriate to reveal. So that is a very quick discussion of biographical interviews, and I hope that you've found it interesting. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that I can say thank you very much, and I hope you found that useful. Good luck with your research, and goodbye.